So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about One Health and the context of the environment and environmental management. And I will talk a little bit about, I think, some important facts or truths that we need to be keeping in mind as we consider One Health, environment, and ecosystems. I'll talk about some of the big challenges that I see and that we've encountered in trying to implement One Health, particularly with the ecosystem and biodiversity angles, and then also discuss a little bit about where to go from here. And I think it's important to keep in mind that for us to really accomplish One Health and bring in and engage the ecosystem services and biodiversity, we have to be thinking a little differently than when we started to come up with these problems. And I think part of the engagement challenge that we have actually relates to this. We're thinking the old way, and I want to sort of stimulate particularly the students, because you're our future, for coming up with new and innovative ways forward. Think about how we can do this in a more creative way. So I think at the end of the day, we know One Health really focuses on achieving human health, and we have a complex dynamic. We have to really balance the needs of people. We have to ensure sustainable and functional ecosystems. And we know we have an increasing growing human population. We have a lot of development and consumption, and food demand is going up significantly. And we have to do this with a limited number of natural resources. So this is the complexity of the challenge that we're up against. And the first fact that I want to sort of highlight is that, we know One Health has to deal with the health of people, livestock, wildlife, and the environment. But I think what we forget, and we need to get better at this, is talking about, we're also aiming for functional ecosystems. We don't ever talk about that. That's never in a One Health slide that I've ever seen. And we as mostly medical community need to start helping the environmental people or the ecologists and biologists to know that we're thinking about things that are important to them also. If we don't bring them closer and help them understand that we know and that we care about those things, then we're never going to have a conversation. We're speaking two different languages, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. What do you think it is? Sorry?
It is river.
Rivers, okay? Could be water, right? The movement of water at a global level. What else could it be? Just shout it out.
Ocean currents.
Ocean currents, okay? Air currents. Another idea?
Transport of animal products.
Transport of animal products. Okay. Well, what this actually is radio-marked wild birds that are either ducks or geese. And this is really some of the work that's been done trying to understand the role of wild birds in avian influenza and the spread of the high-path avian influenza viruses. And you can see, there's quite a dynamic movement globally. And east meets west, north meets south. So there are no barriers. And just like all the other things that you mentioned that this could be, it's the same story, right? People, products, animal, wildlife, all are moving everywhere without boundaries. So this is something that we're really needing to keep in mind as we deal with One Health. We also know that human, animal, and environmental health are very closely linked to ecological realities governing life. Where do we get our fish that we're eating? From the ocean. Where are we getting the fruit that we're eating? From pollination by bats. So crops are growing. I mean, this is the environment, yet at the end of the day, all of this goes into our health. We also know that a fully functional ecosystem really enables all species within it to be healthy. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about an agroecological system, an urban ecosystem, or a natural one. All of it contains the sectors that we're all interested in from a health standpoint. And looking at the future, we know that the demographics dictate that there will be a huge population increase coming. It's already on its way, but 10 billion people between up towards 2050. How are we going to feed them all? Where's all the resources going to come from to make these people be able to have happy and healthy lives? Also, you heard about poverty being a major challenge, right? And we recognize that with more people. It's not just about having food, but it's also having livelihoods and ability to take care of your families. And so we recognize these are two major elements that we need to look at going forward. Healthy food and agriculture depends on healthy ecosystems. I already alluded to this in the earlier slide, but I just want to point out that we recognize already the interactions between having healthy people and how they interact with animals, potentially vectors of diseases and wildlife in the environment. But when you look at the food production system that we're focusing on here in the middle, soil and water is where it starts. Obviously, people drink that same water, so there's a direct link there. The waste that people produce in production and other types of farming system goes into that water, and then that water moves on to produce crops. And the crops, they can be actually consumed directly by people, or they go into feeding animals. And at the end of the day, you have food production, whether it be livestock or crops, that ultimately is what we rely on for health. But there's also a waste in the production. That waste gets recirculated back into the environment. And also the waste is interacting with these other sectors and vice versa. So we recognize that this complicated system has environmental elements, plants and animals involved, and also lots of interactions with people. So this whole system, having a healthy food and nutrition system, is really very much linked to the environment and environmental health and ecosystem health. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges. We know we need more food, and I work for the Food and Agriculture Organization, so this is probably one of our top priorities, is figuring out how to feed the world. And you have lots of different ways to do it, but one of the primary ways that it's being addressed is by improving livestock production, improving crop production, creating more resilient animals and crops to different things like climate change, low water resource availability. And we know that these farming systems may expand or they may intensify to accommodate for these increased needs. And so there's certain potential costs that we need to think about. We'll know more habitat will potentially be converted into agricultural lands. We know biodiversity could potentially be lost in conjunction with this. Ecosystem services will also be lost associated with this. And then we also have runoff and production byproducts that go into the environment. And we know antimicrobial resistance, for example, is a good opportunity to explain how production practices, whether it be poultry or fish or other animals getting antibiotics, ultimately the waste from those animals or the waste water used to produce those animals goes out into the environment. So when we talk about what are the ecosystem services, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I mean, there are a series of different types of services we get from natural systems. We get water, clean water and food, we get clean air. If we start affecting the services, these things all decline in quality. We also can regulate floods and we can regulate disease. If we start to lose ecosystem services, on the flip side, we have more problems there. Cultural services. Many people go into nature for spiritual reasons, recreational or religious purposes. Again, those won't be available. And finally, some supporting services which involve like soil formation, nutrient recycling. These are really elements that help contribute to improving or preventing greenhouse gas and climate change related issues. So we see the ecosystems that we live in really are important to us in many different ways. And the other thing that's important is that there's a cost associated with the services provided. So if you look at forests, oceans, rivers, whatever system you want to look at, if we have to, for example, replace trees to compensate for the CO2 that we might remove by cutting down large sets of trees, they've done some, there are estimates on the cost of replacing these ecological systems. And so to offset one coal power plant, it will cost approximately $7 million in planting trees. And so you can go through all the different systems and evaluate what the economic costs are. And I think just the bottom line, if you take a look at just these three examples, we're not talking about trivial amounts of money. And this is, this is at a very small scale. and we go on and on with the different challenges, particularly water being one of the big ones coming up in the future. So one of the challenges that I think, and I alluded to in the beginning, can we speak the same language? So can medically trained people speak to ecologists? Can ecologists speak to medically trained people? And some people say journalists and media can bridge this gap, but I think we are also responsible for bridging this gap. And we know that we have sort of the ministries of medicine or health or agriculture on one side of the coin. The other side is the Ministry of Natural Resources and Ministry of Environment. We have biologists and ecologists who are associated with the Ministry of Forestry, Natural Resources. We have veterinarians and doctors on the other side primarily. And so the problem is that we say health as medically trained people, they say functional ecosystems as ecologically trained people. And these words don't necessarily match one another. We're not speaking the same language, and I think we have to do better as medical people to understand what they are doing and how they speak about health, and vice versa. There needs to be an effort to help them understand the things that we mean by health. And it's just to elaborate just a final bit on this point, health in a medical definition really is morphological, physiological, and psychological well-being, whereas the ecologists look at it from the standpoint of maximum amount of biodiversity, trophic levels, genetic diversity, balanced coevolution of pathogens and hosts, maximum services, etc. So you can see these are very different paradigms for describing the same broad concept, which is a healthy system or healthy people. So when we talk about diseases, the resource managers, they don't really understand very well the main drivers of diseases, but we can recognize that all of them have something to do with habitats and agroecological systems. And so we've done, I think, a poor job or not a good enough job at helping them understand this. We know there are lots of effects of diseases on people, and the costs of these responses for diseases are huge. But I think, again, we haven't done a great job at helping the resource managers understand the impacts of diseases on wildlife populations. And here are some examples where it's very significant. We've lost a large amount of our wildlife in the last 30, 40 years, okay? And this is, again, speaking directly to the loss of biodiversity. So where do we go from here? I think we need better mechanisms to properly engage these ministries of forestry, natural resources. I don't know what percentage of people are from the Ministry of Environment or Forestry here at this conference, but I suspect it's relatively low compared to the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture. So they're not really engaged. And if you go to One Health platforms and other One Health meetings, you see the Ministry of Environment has a very small voice compared to the other voices in the room. And that's where we're failing, I think, and we have to be better at what we do to engage them. I think we need to actually develop a better training and advocacy program, targeting ecologists and biologists and bringing them on board. They often say One Health is not their mandate. I think the problem is we haven't helped them understand how it actually is their mandate and how health, and in this case to them, their language, ecosystem services and biodiversity are very much part of the solution. And I think also we need to promote sustainable and climate smart agriculture practices. There are many solutions out there for doing this, and FAO is really engaged with most countries in the world in promoting and developing these types of approaches that are basically sensitive to preventing biodiversity loss and really trying to prevent ecosystem services from being lost. We need to minimize the human-wildlife-livestock interactions. So thinking about urban planning, land use management, these are things that need to be brought into the One Health work domain. We also need to better regulate, manage, and particularly restore some of the ecosystem services and systems that we've unfortunately destroyed over time. We need to think about how to better manage runoff and contamination of the environment. We're not doing that at a good enough level. And then finally, we need to raise awareness, and particularly at a societal level, we need to understand and help people understand the benefits and services that ecosystems provide to them. We also need to help them understand the costs, the financial costs of losing those services, and then finally, behavioral choices that people can make that actually promotes sustainable resource management, biodiversity, prevention of loss of biodiversity, and these sorts of things. And I don't think that the general public really has an understanding of that. So I'm out of time, but all I'll say about the SDGs is that basically One Health, no matter how you look at it, is very much linked to each and every SDG. And going forward, particularly with commitments that countries have to these SDGs by 2030, using the SDGs as a mechanism to speak particularly to the ministries of forestry, natural resources, and environment, this is an easy conversation to have. They already have commitments at national level. This is a way to move into that domain and really start to engage them. So I am done. Thank you.